So as we get started this morning, this is the wrap up to a series of sermons on hymns. And as we begin today, kind of a little refresher in Presbyterianism. It'll be helpful for this particular hymn. And so what I want to begin with is this. When we say we are Presbyterian, what we are talking about literally is a form of government. The word presbyter comes from the Greek, and it means an elder. And so, when we call ourselves Presbyterian, we're just saying how we organize ourselves. We're not run by bishops. We're not led by all the members of the congregation. Bishop-led churches are Episcopal. Congregational churches are Congregationalist. So we have basically come up with a really fancy word to say that we're a church that's governed by our elders. But that's not all that it means to be Presbyterian. Every Presbyterian ought to be, anyways, Calvinist. And by that, what we mean is that as we look to the Reformation, the founder of what becomes the Presbyterian Church was a man named John Calvin. And he wrote a book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion that became a fundamental theological text on what we are supposed to at least believe. And because we didn't want to follow suit with the Lutherans are named after Martin Luther. And it's kind of saying that they really just embraced his teachings, his ideas. Well, we call ourselves Calvinist in our theology, but interchangeable with that is the word Reformed. And so you will find churches in the United States that are known as the Reformed churches. Most of them are headquartered in Grand Rapids. So you've got the Christian Reformed Church, you've got the Reformed Church of America, and there are several like Presbyterians. There's bunches of kissing cousins in the Reformed family. But they all are coming from the same place. And if they say in their name that they're Reformed Church, then by and large you can pinpoint that they came from the Netherlands. If, like us, they have in their name Presbyterian, then it by and large means we came from Ireland and Scotland and Northern Ireland. We went with form of government. The Dutch went with the kind of theology that explains who they are. But by and large, we do and we behave the same way, believe the same theology, form kind of the same government of the church. We just sold ourselves, marketed ourselves with different things. We marketed form of government. The Dutch marketed themselves with the theology. But we share these things in common. Now, I say all of this because this hymn, Now Thank We All Are, we gather together. Yeah, one of those moments. We Gather Together is actually one of the older hymns that we've been looking at. It was written in about 1597, and it comes to us from the Netherlands. It actually was written as a hymn of declaration of independence. What happened was when Europe split from the Catholic Church, parts of Europe split over the Catholic Church, there was an attempt by the Catholic kings to reassert the primacy of the Pope back over these lands. And so Prince Philip in Spain, he sent one of his generals, if you will, a man named Alvarez, back into what's known as the Low Country in Europe, but mostly Netherlands. And in a brief period, he executed 10,000 Dutch, and he exiled 40,000 more. His approach to winning people back was to start slaughtering them. And in response to that, the Netherlands declared their independence. I think it was about 1581 that they formally said, you know what, we're going to be independent. But much like in our country, it's one thing to say you're independent. It's another thing to get it. And so what ended up was a period in the 1600s especially, known as the 80 Years' War, which was a bloody period of people trying to get really essentially freedom to be who they were religiously. And for our sake, it was freedom for our fellow Presbyterians, the Reformed, to worship in the way that they felt they must. And so this hymn came to the United States by way of the Netherlands. It came as the Dutch settled into what they called New Amsterdam and we call New York. And it became very popular, especially in the light of World War I and World War II, because as we sing this hymn at the conclusion of our worship, you'll see it declares freedom from those who would oppress us, and it was anticipating all of this hardship that was going to happen on the basis of independence. And so in the United States, this has become kind of our unofficial Thanksgiving hymn because of its themes that are not only gathered around Thanksgiving, but also in times of war, and gathering around and praying to God for preservation, protection, and his ultimate care over us. So that's kind of the history of this. The last other bit is just kind of a curiosity, but I've mentioned before that as we've gone through this sermon series, with a few exceptions, the scripture reading has always been a psalm. And some of these hymns certainly were based on psalms, others weren't. But for all of these, I tried to connect them with a psalm because as we were looking at music in the church, I wanted to pay homage to our rootedness. For most of the life of the Reformed families, Reformed and Presbyterian, we often didn't sing hymns in worship. In the worshiping life of Presbyterian and Reformed churches, we would sing the Psalms, written to simple melodies, because from Calvin and Osiander and some of these great Reformed thinkers, it was always believed that like the history of the church, the best way to honor God was to not let our opinions that were so prone to our own selfish motives get in the way of worship. And so worship was supposed to be so focused on the Bible that we'd lift it up at every moment we could, and that included the singing. John Calvin wrote hymns. So it wasn't that they were anti-hymn, it was hymns were sung in the home. Hymns were sung during Bible studies and other times of gathering. But in church itself, we sang the Psalms. And so it was in 1937 that the Dutch Reformed Church decided that they were going to start singing hymns in church. And this, We Gather Together, was the hymn that they chose as a denomination to be the first hymn that they would sing together as they opened up, gave themselves more freedom to worship God. So this is not only a hymn of independence, it's not only a hymn of thanksgiving, it's also a hymn that fills the Dutch with immense pride. It's the hymn that they picked to begin a new entrance into the life of how they worship together. You know, I've mentioned before that John Calvin would be rolling and rolling and rolling over in his grave if he ever walked into our church. With our stained glass and our beautiful windows and organs, John Calvin and for centuries, the Reformed Church was plain buildings with simple windows and simple style. Again, to move away from some of what John Calvin saw were excesses. But we have come a long way. Maybe some of that's good, maybe some of it's not. But either way, we've allowed ourselves a lot more freedom than they did 500 years ago. As we look at the hymn today, again, most of us see this as a thanksgiving hymn. So the history of the hymn is very interesting and very helpful. because it does beg the question as we gather for Thanksgiving. We sing this hymn and others. What is the rootedness of our thanks? What does it mean to give thanks? And it seems like it would be self-evident, but I think we're living in a time where you see it's harder and harder for people to be thankful. Our world is surrounded by people who are angry, people who want something, people who are protesting and are victims at every time. And it's not to say that there aren't things worth fighting for. There's always been a tension in life between being grateful and being content where we are, and yet also seeing evil in this world and bringing light into dark. And sometimes when light confronts dark, there's conflict. And so that's always been the struggle in the church, which is where and when do we protest? How do we protest? And yet always be a people rooted in grace, mercy, forgiveness, which are required in order to live lives of deep thankfulness. And one of the problems is that there is a real challenge, even in Christian circles, between what I would just call, and I know I'm a preacher, so I get cute from time to time, but the difference between thanksgetting and thanksgiving. And the difference is this. Thanksgetting is what we're getting into now at Christmas time, where our kids put their lists together of everything they want, and then they judge Christmas morning by what they got based on what they asked for. Thanksgetting is Joel Osteen. Thanksgetting is a spiritual life that says God owes me. If I'm doing all of these things that God says, I'm tithing and I'm going to church and I'm doing this, then God owes me health and wealth and prosperity. And I'm not picking on him. That's what he teaches. But the difference is this. Thanksgetting is looking at my life and deciding for myself what I am owed. And then looking at the last bit of period, the last 12 months of my life, and saying, how am I doing relative to my expectations? When I look at where I'm supposed to be, when I was 19 years old and I was in college and I was thinking about where I would be at 35, when I thought at that time 35 was being an old man, how am I doing relative to the way I expected my life to turn out? Or in shorter term cycles, is I looked at the beginning of this year and I expected this stuff to occur, and instead I got this. And when we live lives of thanksgetting, it's awfully hard sometimes to be thankful. Now again, if we got what we asked for, we're really happy. If we got more than we asked for, boy, then it's really hard not to be grinning from ear to ear. But if we expected success, promotion, raise, we expected happy children, happy home life, and in the course of the last year or 2 years, we found sickness or disease, we found death, we found embarrassment, loss of job, we found all these other things that some of them can't be predicted. It's just all of a sudden a call in the middle of the night. Are you? Or a test result comes in and flips all those hopes. Where then is thankfulness coming? If we live lives of thanksgetting, anticipating what we are owed, and that doesn't work out according to our plans, how are we thankful? But thanksgiving is an entirely different concept. Thanksgiving is our ability, no matter what happens in the circumstances of our lives, to give back. It's not about getting, it's about giving, and that entirely changes the dynamic, because it's no longer about what I'm anticipating or what I'm expecting or what I feel like I deserve based on whatever factors I'm employing in my modeling. Thanksgiving is a discipline. It's a way of life. It's finding ourselves. Again, We Gather Together was written at a time of extraordinary violence, a time of extraordinary fear and anxiety. This was a time period where the Dutch were trying to set themselves in their new Calvinistic theological belief system. They were trying to establish who they were and who they wanted to be and their children were to be. But they knew to get from here to there was going to cost deeply. Many of them who were gathered weren't going to live. And we see that there was this terrifically, horrifically violent period before the Dutch were able to truly celebrate the freedom that they were singing about here. When we live lives of thankfulness, that's why I said at the outset, we cannot live lives of thankfulness without the underlying doctrines, if you will, of grace and mercy and forgiveness. Because until we put ourselves wholly and truly into God's hands, like Paul, right? What will separate, Romans 8, where Paul says, what will separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ? And then he goes through this whole list of things. Very similar to Psalm 107, right? Psalm 107 is this beautiful hymn with showing people in different walks of life. These people found themselves in desperate straits. And again, if you paid attention to the psalm, most of these people were getting what they deserved. These were disobedient people in all these different walks. They were either gambling with their lives out on the sea, or they were disobedient to their rulers, or they were disobedient to God. They were disobeying the law. And they were finding themselves reaping what they ought to expect. In the ancient days, you put yourself on a boat on the sea. Don't go crying when the sea upends your boat. If you are disobeying your political leaders, don't be crying when they come and they imprison you. When you disobey God, when He gives you His word and His teachings, and you recklessly abandon them, why are you crying when He disciplines you? But in all of those refrains, and this was Psalm 107 really reads like a hymn. It's verse and chorus, verse and chorus. And the verses, every verse says, this is where these people were in their misery. And then it says, they cried out and God came to them. And so we praise the steadfast love of the Lord. Again, it's a reminder of what Paul tells us where he says that God is faithful even when we are faithless, because that's who our God is. That is the basis for thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is knowing that we who deserve nothing from God have received everything from Him. We who deserve the wrath of God, because you look in the mirror in front of a holy God, same with me, it's not about us. The hard moment of faith is that one brief moment of utter honesty where we look at ourselves and we just go, yeah, I have nothing to offer God. I have done these things to hurt people around me. I've not obeyed God or followed His word. And yet, and that's the rootedness, is at the moment we would almost go to despair. What have I to offer God? It's at that moment that God says, you don't have anything to offer me, but I've offered you my Son. And when we get that, we can always find a moment to be thankful. Now, to be sure, it is not easy to be thankful when the doctor calls with you or your spouse's test results. It is not easy to be thankful when grief seems to just overwhelm you. How can you be thankful? And we saw in the prayer requests about siblings being split from one another because of being forced into foster homes because they've got addicted or neglectful or abusive parents. And if you know anything about the child service system, it says a lot. It doesn't require a little neglect or a little abuse, because most of the time they'll keep those kids there. It requires an obscene amount of evil to get these kids split up. How are we thankful in the midst of that? How are we thankful in the midst of the world where there's so much slavery and human trafficking, all of these real evils, and it's really easy in your own personal life, or when you turn on the TV, or when you see all these global ails, it is really, really easy to be overwhelmed by the darkness. And that is precisely why thanksgiving is not an attitude but a discipline. Thanksgiving isn't about how we feel, it's about a deep-seated belief. We can feel hopeless. We can feel afraid. We can feel angry. Our bodies are going to sometimes feel the way they are, upended, chaotic, almost to the point of being overwhelmed. But it's the discipline that should come in. A life marked with thankfulness becomes a discipline, because hopefully day in and day out, especially in times of neutrality, in times when life is great, when we learn to cultivate thankfulness in those times, then when those dark days come, we have that habit of thankfulness to draw upon. Because Paul was able to thank God when he was able to evangelize a city, and he was able to thank God when he was being dropped over the wall, bruised and beaten within an inch of his life. Paul was able to thank God when he was able to preach in Athens, and he was able to thank God when he was arrested. Paul was able to always thank God because he had cultivated a life of grace-filled appreciation to his Redeemer. Paul understood that his life began when God grabbed his attention. And because it was God who grabbed his attention, every day was trying to find himself within the will of God. Good days and bad days alike. And so for Paul, and for anyone who lives a life of discipline, thanksgiving becomes a mindset. Not a holiday, but a daily lived life that looks in the midst of the good things in life and the bad things in life, and looks to a God who offered us, who deserves nothing, his only Son. And then we can say, I might have nothing. I might not have any money. I might not have any health. I might not have any friends. But I have Jesus Christ. And what God tells me is, if I have Jesus Christ, I have life, and I have life abundantly. And the task for you and for me is to learn how to believe that the promises of God are just that abundant, that grace-filled, that loving, that merciful, that we can sometimes look beyond this life to the life that God has prepared for us, because sometimes that's how bad life gets. To be able to thank God in the midst of the overwhelming darkness of life, and see that in the darkness of life, God is still promising the light of his love. That is how we change our attitudes from thanksgiving to thanksgiving. Amen.